Charlemagne the God here. I can't wait to see you at the Black Effect Podcast Festival, coming to you live on Saturday, April 22nd at the Pullman Yards in Atlanta, hosted by myself and Jess Hilarious. If you haven't gotten your tickets, what are you waiting for? The Black Effect is bringing some of the hottest podcasts live, like the 85 South Show, Horrible Decisions, and Big Facts for one day only, okay? For inspiring podcasters, we've got you covered. If you don't want to miss the Black Effect Podcast Festival, make sure to get your tickets today at blackeffect.com.
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to the new podcast presented by the female film critics of InSession Film. We are speaking, we love movies, we are Women in Session. The Women in Session podcast, Ms. Zita Short of the 300 Passions podcast, is here with me. I'm Kristin Battestella at Therefore Review. We're holding down the fort a little bit here for InSession Film. We have some of our critics are all off at South by Southwest. They're on adventures. Our illustrious leader, Mr. JD, is back in with baby action happening. Congratulations there. We now have another player for our in-session hockey team. So Miss Zita, we decided everybody else is on an adventure. We're going to have some adventures of our own here. Talk about some adventure movies, swashbuckler films, which we've mentioned off and on before that it seems like a lot of that's lacking in contemporary cinema, that they don't have the fun and the charisma that some of these I don't know, adventure, romp, period piece kind of movies kind of have. You like this genre of films?
Oh, yes, I love it. I just think there's such a great exuberance to a lot of these older swashbucklers. And I do find it frustrating, even as a trend in film criticism, that people don't take fun blockbusters in this genre seriously. And you have to provide a sort of dark, gritty take on one of these stories in order to receive critical acclaim. And I think that's stupid. I think you look back on something like The Adventures of Robin Hood from 1938, and it's a masterpiece. Yes, it's pop storytelling. It doesn't have that much depth. Perhaps it doesn't have enough to say about the sort of Marxist themes that are embedded into the storyline. At the same time, it's so beautifully constructed that I can't imagine anyone not having a good time with it. Errol Flynn, not the greatest actor in the world, probably the best use of his talents that we have. And the cinematography, the set design, everything is immaculate in that film. And they keep trying to make more Robin Hood movies. And they perfected it in 1938. I don't feel as though there's any way that you could possibly improve on what they did. And no one has really managed to. So,
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get into fantasy. That's a whole separate kind of genre. But I love like Arthurian things, Camelot things. I always read those stories growing up. And I'm still waiting for like the perfect King Arthur movie to come along, even though TV and movies have been trying. And Robin Hood, it's so funny because, everybody always points to Prince of Thieves, of course. But I always say to people, but Errol Flynn and the Disney Fox, they're like the best Robin Hoods. You don't need any other versions of Robin Hood. And there were a couple zany TV shows in there too that they made of Robin Hood that are kind of kitschy, have not stood the test of time. But it's so funny. I love Robin Hood, Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland together. It's so colorful. And it's just like the sword fighting, going up the stairs, it's just so excellent, and I said swashbucklers. I think it's maybe that's its own subset of genre within adventure. But to me, it's like, I don't know, I automatically think of sword fighting. And I love Three Musketeers material as well. It's ironic because The Three Musketeers itself as a book is one of the few books that I've never finished, that I just got so frustrated and just threw it across the room because it suffers from a poor translation from many years ago. I think there's actually been a newer version, and we mentioned before, Miss Zita, The Count of Monte Cristo, the 2002 movie we talked about before on a podcast. Love that one. Love the book. It's available on Hulu now, so yay. But one of the first films that I remember seeing that I really loved was the silent version of The Man in the Iron Mask. These are all Alexandre Dumas, and just the whole like intensity of trying to get like a key off of somebody's neck, and the music playing and the back and forth at the ball. And of course, it's also been redone with Leonardo DiCaprio. But that was one of those where I was like, this is tense. There's no words. But I'm hooked. This is really enthralling. It's just that I feel like sometimes the simplicity of these great stories, good guys, bad guys, the quest, so to speak.
Yes, I do love that style of storytelling. And as you point out, it does have sort of a cheerfully innocent quality that I appreciate. And I do think that's something universally relatable, no matter what background you come from, about wanting to go out and explore and to face trials and tribulations and overcome them and to make friends along the way. And all of those elements of these stories are timeless in their way. It's why they've become cliches. It's why we see these same narrative structures recurring again and again and again. And when you put the pieces together correctly, you can create something really beautiful. And I have realized over the last couple of years that there is more variety in the genre than I had initially assumed. Recently, I had the opportunity to watch The Thief of Baghdad, the version from 1924, even though arguably the 1940 version has become even more famous and beloved. But this film is fascinating in that, yes, it has all of these elements that we associate with the genre. You have this grand set, you have groundbreaking special effects, you have Douglas Fairbanks doing his thing. But at the same time, it's very slowly paced, which I would usually say as a critique, a complaint. In this case, it feels very deliberate, though the movie has this sort of dreamlike, trance-like quality. And I was completely taken aback because usually these films are very fast-paced, very energetic, aiming to provide you with these propulsive thrills. And this movie is something very different. I wouldn't call it meditative necessarily because there's not a whole lot of thematic depth here. This is not aiming to be a weighty film, but it definitely gives off a different vibe to the vast majority of movies, I would say, that I've seen. It really has to be seen to be believed. It's unusual. And even the director, Raoul Walsh, doesn't necessarily specialize in that type of film. So just an oddity all around. And I kind of love the fact that there's this conflict between the tone and the pacing of the film and Fairbanks's performance, which is very loud and over the top and out there. And I just love how ostentatious and brash he is as a movie star. I like the fact that he's not suave, he's not sophisticated, and there's a certain appeal to that. He's so open and honest about how dorky he is in many regards.
So do you have a preference then between Douglas Fairbanks and Rudolph Valentino?
Yes, so the thing with Valentino, I, like most people, I would say, based on the promotional pictures that we have of him and his reputation as the sort of progenitor of the Latin lover stereotype, I assumed that his whole thing was that he's mysterious and sexy and a bit dangerous, and he's taciturn and he smolders at women instead of trying to come on to them in the way that an ordinary American would. Then you watch his films and it's so odd. He's goofy. It's very strange. He laughs a lot. He embarrasses himself in front of his on-screen love interests. It's just completely unexpected. I feel as though all of those promo shots, he's very moody and brooding, and then you see him up on screen, and there's no correlation between his reputation nowadays and what you actually get. So it's odd. I find it difficult to assess his career, in part because I feel as though I have been led astray in making assumptions about what his films are like. So Douglas Fairbanks, I just find to be so appealing because he's such a straightforward movie star. He is gregarious. He looks happy up on screen, which I appreciate. And yeah, there's just something instinctive in me that responds to that. I like the fact that he is such a sort of straight down the middle professional, does exactly what you expect of him. And he's a fantastic anchor for so many of these films that are very special effects heavy. He's a wonderful movie star. I think he deserves all of the credit that he gets for being a pioneer in that area.
Yes, and in the silent getting into the 30s, a lot of the anachronisms too, you can't help but laugh. Like he's the chic and yet she's got a bob and you can clearly see like his watch, like all the modern kind of stylings in it. I mean, they're kind of laughable now, but in their own way, that's still very entertaining. And it's funny that we've kind of talked about now men leading these early kind of Fairbanks being in the Iron Mask, the Black Pirate, beginning to lead the kind of industry here, because we tend to think it's a modern thing when it's a franchise built around an actor doing some big crazy special effects. And it's like, well, no, it's been going on all along. And it's funny that there is a whole genre of this. Like I love the 1937 version of The Prisoner of Zenda, from the Raritan kind of romances. A lot of these, I guess, are based on books, which that I feel like maybe we've gotten away from a little bit, but there was a whole genre of this. And then they were great in the 30s, and then these things kept getting remade in the 50s. There's like there's two different Musketeer movies, and it's fascinating to look at now, where they just basically said the same script, shot for shot remakes. We're just doing this in color this time. And the 50s versions I don't like as much, which you would think, oh, look at all the magic of cinema. It's like, well, no, the storytelling I don't think is as good. But I really do love the 37 Prisoner of Zenda, which, Zita, do you like that 30s subset?
Yes, I love it. And one of the things that you reference that is great about this specific period of the genre is I think it's Ruritarian, or is it Ruritanian?
Yeah.
Ruritanian, yes, which is a whole subset of sort of adventure novels where it's set in a fictional country, which I think is a great way to get around the charge that is commonly held against these films when they're set in an actual country, which is, oh God, it's culturally insensitive, you're exoticizing these other people and this very important culture, and oh no, are there colonialist undertones? Making it Ruritania really helps you to elide a lot of those problems. And you watch these movies today, and sorry, I keep making this point, but the energy is just off the charts. I like the fact that so many of these films are very fast-paced. They're 90 minutes long. They're lean in so many regards. You really get the sense that the screenwriters were willing to sort of strip it back to the basics. The stories are often quite simple, but that gives you time to get to know the characters. And one of the wonderful things about the pop sensibility that is present in so many of these films is just how unrealistic these films are willing to be. And you get these characters who are in no way ordinary. They would not fit in the real world. They're not fully rounded. They don't have depth as characters, but it is fun to spend time in their presence. And for a lot of these writers, many of whom were humorists or worked for newspapers before going over to Hollywood, I think it's a really great place to sort of showcase their wit with these characters, instead of having to have the plot sort of slow down so the characters can sit around and deliver speeches and hold forth on important issues. You can have these scenes where they're just sort of throwing out quips or they're flirting with their on-screen love interest. And it's very appealing. You get dashes of that sort of Algonquin round table style wit. And I think it's a great place for them to sort of show off that talent.
I think today we're surprised that they're better than we expect. I mean, even because it's as simple as it could be, like, oh, a lookalike, switches with the king of the fictitious country, but then like when they're doing their fight scenes and they're just using, old fashioned like stand-ins and split screens. And you're like, this is still fun. This is still entertaining. And there's still, a lot of impressive action. And this was Ronald Colman and Madeline Carroll. It's the remake that is it. No, not Lana Turner, Deborah Carr. Maybe that's why I don't like it. Stuart Graham, James Mason. It's just that it just seems more dry. I don't know, because that one is much more worried about the sets and the spectacle. I don't enjoy that one as much, but that's just me. But I love Musketeer stuff. And it's again, I like the older Musketeers. That I want to say it's 33. Is that the year?
The Gene Kelly one? Oh no. Okay.
There's been so many now I can't keep track. There's the 1948 is the Gene Kelly Lana Turner one. That one's just okay, I think. But it's so funny because the then you have the 73, 74 ones with like Michael York and all. I love those. I loved Michael York when I was a kid. I'm like, I don't even care about Romeo and Juliet. And they're like, no, I like Tybalt more. And it's so funny to see the difference because like there's been a couple movies and a couple TV shows, I think, of the Musketeers recently, and I didn't like them because they were just so dark and so depressing and so serious and thematically and the way they looked. And I feel like you're completely missing the Dumas spirit if you don't have, bosoms and fun and color.
Bosoms.
It's like, it's like I just, Raquel Welch now, Faye Dunaway, also in the 70s versions, which they ended up actually having to make up some laws in Hollywood because they shot so much footage that they were like, you know what, we'll make 2 movies out of this, and just, neglected to inform the cast or pay them that was what they were doing. But they're wonderful movies. Christopher Lee, of course, is the villain. And there's an excellent scene in the second one, The Four Musketeers, where they are sword fighting on ice. And the only thing that would make this more exciting to me is if they were wearing ice skates. And even though the movie is, 45 years old, and I'm looking at this, you swear like they're slipping and sliding all over the place, still fighting, and you're like, the ice is going to crack. Oh my God, this is so intense. But it's so fun and it's so exciting, and just, people drinking and swinging, out the windows, when the husbands are supposed to come back home, that sense of charm and fun. Do you like Musketeer things, Zita?
I'm not as familiar with this media property. Clearly, you are a major enthusiast, but I assume you're very excited about the new French adaptation of the story. I believe that's a big 2-part epic production with Ava Green and Vincent Cassel, and everyone seems to be involved in it.
Okay, wait a second. I've never heard of this. Wait, is this a
Oh, it's Kristin, it's coming.
Oh,
so
yes.
I assume you're looking forward to that. But yes, that's definitely one of the novels that just keeps getting adapted, as you pointed out. And it is funny, some of these stories really do seem to endure longer than others. For example, the Ellen Quatermain series, which was very popular during the first half of the 20th century, and I believe was adapted again in the 80s with Sharon Stone. I believe that was an unsuccessful film, King Solomon's Mines.
Yeah.
And I would say that that character has largely disappeared from the public consciousness since then, and has been replaced with heroes like Indiana Jones, for example, who I believe was inspired by that character.
That's
so
what happened with that. Yeah, it was like, it was property that was before, but then like Alan Quartermain and the Lost City of Gold came out like after Raiders of the Lost Ark, so everyone thought it was a knockoff. And it's one of those kitschy, like 80s films are a whole different world. Like when you can watch like The Beastmaster or like Sheena, and they're PG, but they have nudity in them. And like, they're all jungle, crazy adventure stuff. It's amazing some of the things the 80s got away with. And like Sharon Stone is in those. Cassandra Peterson, I think in one of them is like the queen, and she's like the villain, and Elvira is like your evil queen in like these romps. But then they've got crazy like Amazon women, like kitschy sex kind of comedy, kind of spoof movies of these too. So I wondered when we would get to Indiana Jones, because we've been talking about bigger period piece swashbuckler things, which I love. The Scarlet Pimpernel, I feel like maybe European things after the 50s kind of epic remakes kind of died out. I feel more like British or European cinema is where we got Musketeers. I wrote about it at InSessionFilm.com. The Scarlet Pimpernel version with Jane Seymour and Ian McKellen. You know, I feel like they started doing like their BBC type of adaptations that we love. And then Indiana Jones brought back that kind of fun serial kind of adventure to, you know, American box office. So I wanted to ask you, Zita, when did we cross the line between when in the past classic films, these were big epic costume pieces and got nominated for lots of awards. But even though we all love Indiana Jones, I mean, I think it was nominated for like Best Picture.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you know, but I feel like we've segued into this, oh, these are pop, these are fun movies, these aren't critically acclaimed movies, that divide between the audience and the critic. But to me, I don't see that, because they're just fun for everybody.
Yes, and I would say a difference nowadays is that less of these movies get made, or at least our traditional conception of the adventure film has changed, I guess you could say, because as usual, we keep bringing them up, but Marvel, they dominate everything now. And I suppose you could make an argument that some of their superhero films qualify as adventure movies, but it does feel different. And more recent efforts to make a straight up old-fashioned adventure film, I'm thinking of Jungle Cruise, for example, haven't been entirely successful. I don't think anyone watched that and thought, oh, wow, Dwayne Johnson and Emily Blunt, they are the inheritors of Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart's legacies. It was fine, but you don't look at it and think, wow, the adventure genre is back. Give me 10 more of these.
I think we've forgotten how to do adventure just as a genre in itself, because I mean, I also wrote, because I was looking at your 300 passions list at InSessionFilm.com, and there wasn't any that to me were swashbuckler adventure films, which I was kind of surprised, because I thought part of these movies is always the girl who's along for the ride, who's, you know, the hero, and there's always, you know, a rescue and a big kiss type thing. But I wrote about Kong Skull Island, and I feel like we don't know how to do adventures unless they stray into sci-fi, fantasy, or horror. And I mean, I like this one. There were a lot of problems with the Skull Island, but it was like what worked, what I wanted to see more. The people on the island in the adventure, you know, wasn't what we got. It was more like it just became a placeholder, because there had been a Godzilla movie. Now they were making a King Kong prequel, just so they could later make like a Godzilla versus Kong, like MonsterVerse kind of thing. And I'm like, well, instead of going through the motions, why couldn't you just make the good adventure movie? But and we take pot shots at Marvel, which isn't always fair, but how much of it is also Disney, because we could talk about Pirates of the Caribbean.
Ugh.
How many? For me, Indiana Jones is the 3 movies and the original version of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. They started messing with the show, rearranging everything. Then they made this other one with the Mutt Williams, the Crystal Skull. And I'm like, no, keep it. You can keep it. That they're making a new one. It's like, just stop. Just stop. Do you like the Indiana Jones movie, Zita?
I do. I have some reservations with the later entries in the series, and I'm not too excited about this Dial of Destiny movie that's coming out, as much as I'm saying that I want classic adventure films to come back. I really do abhor the modern trend of let's dig up this franchise that was popular 40 years ago and show up at the lead actor's house with a truck full of money and say, hey, appear on screen again. It's just humiliating in a way for them. I know they're getting paid so much money. It doesn't really matter. It just makes me sad to see this pale shadow of something that I once loved. And it really does feel like an attempt on their part to take advantage of the nostalgic affection that a lot of audience members have for these movies. But it also creates this bizarre infantilization effect, because it's a movie that's designed to make people who were 12 years old when the first one came out feel that age again. But it also has the weird effect of, oh, we don't need to progress. We don't need to move beyond this. We don't need to create new art. The movies that you loved when you were 12, those are great movies. And you deserve to receive a recycled version of that film that you loved. And so for as much as I'm saying I wish that they could take inspiration from these older films, I would still like them to be original properties that don't have to star 78-year-old actors who appeared in a popular adventure film in their 20s. It would be nice if we had real movie stars anymore, but if some of the hot young actors coming up today could appear in their own adventure film that is not a reboot or a remake or a retooling of some intellectual property.
You would think that the first was Raiders of the Lost Ark. You would think they would have learned their lesson, because obviously Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is not as beloved. And I don't think it's a bad movie. I could tell you simplistically, the problem is it does not deal with European and Christian ideology. It's, goes out to, where do they use a fictitious country as their version too? Somewhere out in the Southeast Asia, for a guy who wants to, rip out children's hearts, all of a sudden I can understand why people were a little pulled back by that. So then you can tell when they reset it and say, okay, we're going to go back to, we had the Ark of the Covenant. Now we're going to have the Holy Grail. He's going to be fighting Nazis. This is something everybody can get behind. And it's ironic. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is the first movie that I saw in the movie theater, Father's Day, 1989. And it's amazing that I still remember that. I remember my sister complaining the entire time, and you get the fun opening with River Phoenix, and you're like, oh, this could be good. And then when they did the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles on TV, you're like, this is great. This is like Saturday night family fun. There's history thrown in. It's charming. There's adventure to it. You don't have to dig too deeply into it. And then what happens, when it comes out on DVD, all of a sudden, Lucas and Spielberg had to keep messing with it and rearranging things and editing it and changing it. And you're like, just stop, take it easy. Take it easy. So I love Indiana Jones. My husband doesn't care for them very much. They're the kind I put on anytime and love them and enjoy them. And sometimes I find myself quoting, 3, 3, 7, 7, X marks the spot, because you're talking about the way these things just keep beating the dead horse. I do have to mention, Pirates of the Caribbean, based on the Disney ride. You know, the first one was okay when I saw it. I mean, I think my nieces were like Jack Sparrow, everything. They thought it was so wonderful. And there was the original 3 of them, and then they had to make a fourth one. They made a 5th one, and it's like, I don't even know. I don't even care. Isn't it just the same movie over and over again? I don't feel like something like that you would think should have brought the genre back, and it didn't, because it was like, no, the genre is just this franchise only, you know, and I don't think that's fair.
Yes, and of course, something that stands out here is that Steven Spielberg is a cut above a lot of the directors that they allow to helm some of these later entries in these franchises. So you do wonder, if he were to be brought back, would things improve a bit? At the same time, what you're talking about with the politics of these films, sorry, we're going to get political now. Again, I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I guess it's condescending to suggest that, oh, these are just popcorn films and they're not able to deal with real issues. I'm sure that there is a world in which you could craft The Thief of Baghdad style adventure film that is also about class solidarity, and that does have a very serious political message. At the same time, when these films try to tackle race or try to take a stand against anything, they do tend to come across as a bit clumsy in their handling of these issues. And I know that a big complaint about Indiana Jones's presentation of Nazis was that, oh, well, it turns them into cartoons. And that means that the children who watch these films don't fully understand the true horror of what they did in real life. And instead of viewing them as these awful human beings who committed a genocide, who did all sorts of awful things, they think, oh, haha, this Nazi on screen is just like the animated alien that I watched in this other film who gets murdered at the end of the film. I don't entirely agree with that critique. I would hope that the parents who take their kids to see this movie allow them to gain an education on these issues at a later date. I guess maybe there's an argument to be made that these films don't do enough to establish just how bad the Nazis were in real life. But as a choice of villain, they're certainly less controversial than, say, the Russians in the 80s, when it definitely felt as though they were taking pot shots at them, or even more controversially, Indians, or whenever they try to introduce a villain from Asia and it is inevitably horribly racist.
Well, that's what you said, clumsy, clunky, like the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. Morgan Freeman, wonderful in it. And then you're like, but the Kevin Costner accent, you're like, no. And that's what I find clumsy about. There was the King Arthur movie with Clive Owen and Ioan Griffith, where they were trying to talk about them being like the Sarmatian soldiers who came over to Britain. And it's like, when you're trying to weave something serious with the history, it doesn't work. And it feels like it's one extreme or the other. When they try something and it's gritty and it falls flat, or I don't like a lot of the silly jokes in like the pirate movies, but like Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade, like I love that it is kind of about him being crusty, you know. He's like, it's not the age, it's the mileage, you know. And I do think we underestimate kids. If these are family movies, like the pirate movies, think the kids need to have the joke with like the glass eye, like rocking around the ship, you know, or something. But like I think we underestimate. Maybe it was because these were PG movies in the 80s before the PG-13 rating, that kids we underestimate them as viewers. When, you know, when they open the Grail and he's saying, or when they open the Ark of the Covenant and he's saying, you know, don't do that, and he tells her, close your eyes, don't look. That's a scary scene, you know, when all the evil comes out, and, you know, and in The Last Crusade when he comes back for the book, and she says, why? And she says, no, I believe in it. And he says, well, if you side with them, who gives a damn what you think? So I feel like there is moments of where they are simply saying good versus evil. And today we underestimate the audience, I think, in that, like it's funny because I think we mentioned it before. Did we talk in detail about Romancing the Stone? Because when you said Spielberg, it reminded me like Zemeckis, a good director who came along. And there are parts of it where there's shootouts with, Colombian drug lords. Is that the point of the movie? No, but it's like they're just the bad guys and these are the good guys. And that's enough that we're on this adventure. I love Romancing the Stone. Jewel of the Nile is a step down. It's not as entertaining, but I don't know if that's because I wouldn't say that it's female centric, but just because it's a different take and it's got the opposites attract, and it does put the romance, shall we say, to the forefront, but it has charm, it has chemistry.
Yes, and that was definitely intended to be Raiders of the Lost Ark for a female audience. Look at it through, well, Marion Ravenwood is a very different character from Joan Wilder, but the idea was, what if it was through a lady's eyes? And I do think the screenwriter successfully handles that shift in perspective. And I do find it interesting that after Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was such a smash in the early 80s, it was, I think, the highest grossing film of 1981. You don't get that many more, I would say, A-tier adventure films. It feels as though there are a lot of sort of low-budget rip-offs of Raiders of the Lost Ark and a lot of B-movie type films that were clearly made on a relatively low budget. And I know I sound like a complete snob when I say this. It is possible to create great art with very little money, but a lot of these films display a real lack of imagination. And I do find it interesting that they didn't make more of an effort after Romancing the Stone and all of those other hits to sort of keep the genre going. It feels as though one of these films comes along every 3 or 4 years and one of them becomes a huge hit. But there's never a real revival in the genre. In the 30s, almost every week, there would be a big adventure movie in cinemas. And it's just not the same way. Sorry, if you listen to this podcast, you will be very sick of hearing me talk about how wonderful the 30s were as a period in cinema history. And I know they weren't perfect in many regards, but it was a great time for cinema in that you did have an abundance of star vehicles and just the fact that so many of these genres had a market at that time. It does feel as though, for as much as in the internet age, it's possible to have a really niche interest and to find other people who share that fascination. It does feel as though in the mainstream sense, markets are shrinking and it's becoming more and more difficult for smaller genres to find an audience.
So you bring up a very good point. The idea of the serials, that's where Lucas and Spielberg got these ideas for Star Wars, Indiana Jones, the old Flash Gordon movies, which are very terrible. There's, they're going off the planet Ming and it's like a paper plate on a string is like their spaceship. They're very bad. But it was the idea that people went to the movies on a regular basis. They saw these little series. They were able to follow along the story. And that comes from, like Charles Dickens used to serialize these stories in newspapers. People were used to that kind of ongoing storytelling. And I love Ray Harryhausen movies, and, I love like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And then they did later Golden Voyage or Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. I think the one with Jane Seymour, again, I wrote about at In Session Film. And Clash of the Titans, I love them and I still think they look great, skeletons, fighting and the ships and the automatons. I'm sure there's probably a lot of cultural appropriation. You've got Patrick Wayne playing Sinbad, like, okay, John Wayne's son. Yeah, no. It looks beautiful, but no. And it's funny, but I feel like today we would almost say they're kids' films. And Clash of the Titans comes out 80 or maybe 83. Not sure, but it's like to think that, and again, these also stray into fantasy, where you have that came out around the same time as Indiana Jones, and it's like, oh, that old stuff is for the kids, because here now we're getting into serious filmmaking, and this is the time where it's changing of families going to the cinema, but franchises and merchandising, I think, becomes more important than movies making more. Like you're saying, finding the audience and continuing to tell good stories and doing what's right. And I think we've discussed this before, maybe in some of our in-session chats, where when did Disney become Disney? And to me, it's like, well, this in the 80s, when like The Little Mermaid came along, when they realized they could merchandise these things and they could market things for their TV channels, just like they're doing today. And the way you said that the market is shrinking. We keep seeing these shows being canceled left and right after only like 6 or 10 episodes. And it's like, I never even heard of the show till it was canceled. I never heard of the streaming network that this show is on. And it's like, it's too crowded. There's too much and nothing can find an audience. And it just seems like even something like the goofy HBO, when they used to have like a TV show per season. And it was like, you knew the schedule, you could build up the anticipation. There were 4 quality shows, as opposed to now they're talking about all the crazy Warner combining with Discovery and they're going to drop this and that. And it's just, to me, it's not anything that appeals to the audience. It detracts the audience. And it's like, you miss the enjoyment of what was going to the cinema to see these movies. But maybe that's just me.
Yes, and another, I guess, point that we have to touch on in talking about the adventure genre is this question of whether these movies are for children or whether they're only for a juvenile audience. And I feel as though that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like most people, I think it's possible to craft a great kids movie. I think it's important that we don't automatically dismiss this sort of film. At the same time, I think a big complaint from a lot of critics especially is that the popularity of this sort of film means that audiences in general are dumbed down, they are infantilized, and adults are encouraged to consume children's entertainment so often that the market for adult films, genres like thrillers or, let's say, domestic dramas, they sort of dry up because adults are being told, well, do you want to watch this movie where a velociraptor menaces a small child? Or do you want to go to the cinema to watch Meryl Streep and Dustin Hoffman get divorced? And typically in the modern world, we tend to pick the more childish film, which is sort of unfortunate. I think in these cases, I'm not automatically against the blockbuster. I don't want to make it sound as though I feel as though these films shouldn't exist. At the same time, you do wonder, would cinema today be richer? Would the studios be funding a wider variety of films if Star Wars had never been made, if a lot of these 80s blockbusters hadn't come out?
It's ironic because it's a whole separate issue. I guess we're talking about the state of the box office, but like, it's expensive for a family of 5, $25 a piece, getting popcorns, getting sodas. It's like, that's an event. That's, $100 or more, a lot of money, even before the pandemic, but especially after the pandemic, to go to the movies. So it's like, you lose that family audience. And it's funny, I think back of like, do you like the Tarzan movies with Johnny Weissmuller? Because they're like meant considered like kids movies, but then you're like part of it when they're swimming, you're like, this seems like they're kind of naked.
Yes,
I
they
love
are.
movies. And I love those books. And again, Edgar Rice Burroughs' writing is wooden. It's racist. The female characters are bad, but they were entertaining books. And I remember our library when I grew up, you had to go upstairs to the children's section and to get to the Tarzan books. And I remember thinking, like, when I read them then, like, oh, okay, these are kids' books. I'm beyond this. But then I read them when I was a little older, and I thought, these are not children's books. I mean, they talk about a lot of things about colonialism. They make a lot of different statements of who is the villain, who's the stereotypical like person with that kind of plinth kind of hat and the guns coming to kill and bad in the forest, and Tarzan's trying to stop them. I thought we underestimate these kind of children's audiences, and that's shocking, though. You said if Star Wars had never happened, but it's ironic because back then you look at things like I said, that one of the Sinbad movies came out, or no, not Sinbad. It was the other Patrick Wayne movie, the People That Time Forgot. Again, terrible effects, yet I love it. I have to watch it every time I catch it. It's such a kind of bad romp. It came out the same summer, I think, as Star Wars. So you had this old, like, animatronic Harryhausen kind of bad effects compared to Star Wars. And yet it still made money. People went to see it. But then you had something like Conan the Barbarian, just shy of being like a big blockbuster hit, which they then did, I think it was 1984 is when Conan the Destroyer comes out. I love the Conan novels as well. But it's like, the second one is totally PG-13, totally safe, totally kid friendly. But you stop back and you kind of think like, rated R movies were blockbuster movies, which nowadays we can't even fathom how that would be. Like, it'd be like, no, wait, you have to make this movie PG, safe for American audiences. We have to cater something in it is going to be to the Asian market. So we will cast specific people, or we can't have specific things in it. Everything just seems more like the product rather than we're going to do a great adaptation. We're going to tell an entertaining kind of family story.
Yes, I can see what you're saying there. And it's very difficult to understand why we're so down in the dumps at the moment, because you could point out I'm definitely ragging on Spielberg and Lucas and a lot of these populist filmmakers at this moment. At the same time, even in the 90s, there was a much wider variety of films that could become blockbusters. And all of that happened after Star Wars had become a cultural phenomenon, after E.T. had been released, and during the period in which a lot of these children's films were starting to dominate at the box office. What I'm hoping for is for a collapse of sorts of the film industry, and so they'll be forced to rebuild, and hopefully the market, the economy alters permanently, and hopefully that has an effect on audience tastes. This is very overly optimistic. It will never happen. Unfortunately, I think they're just going to run the superhero trend into the ground, but we'll see what happens. Getting back to the adventure genre, which is meant to be our topic at hand, I really do feel as though it's a great genre for the film medium. We talk about this a lot. Are certain stories suited to cinema? And in a lot of cases, you have these efforts to adapt acclaimed novels into films. And the problem is that, it's too internal, too much of it is about this character's inner thoughts, and how can you possibly convey that on screen? And with a lot of these adventure films, the novels that they're based on are classics, in finger quotes, but they're not necessarily critically acclaimed novels. Sometimes the writing is a bit wooden. Often these stories are overly reliant on the basic appeal of their premise and don't manage to build off of their concept. And there's also a sense that they are overly enamored with describing surfaces and with immersing you in an environment without really managing to sketch around the edges, to give you more than that. And on screen, you can do that. You can present the audience with relatively flat caricatures and get away with it because, oh, look at the scenery. Oh, look at this lush, verdant greenery that I'm being shown. Look at the special effects. Look at the spectacle. And so I think it's one of the great pure cinema genres. And I think it's one of the reasons that people used to, at least, flock to the cinema to see these things, because you can't see this on stage. In novelistic form, all of this plays very differently. It really is one of a kind in its way.
Today, there have been a lot of adaptations that have been kind of dark and gritty, where I've watched them and they felt like such a chore because I thought you could read this, but that doesn't mean that it works on screen. And it's funny, I read a lot of these classic books when I was a kid, and I read Howard Pyle did some King Arthur books, and he also did some Robin Hood books. And so I was reading Ivanhoe, and I'm like, oh my God, this book's terrible. I'm like, I hate this book. This is so dry. This is so overly descriptive. And my dad's like, just watch the movie. So then it was the, 57, the Ivanhoe version with Elizabeth Taylor and Robert Taylor. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so great. This is so colorful. What an adventure story. That was like my first experience of, there's the book and this is how they can do the movie, and I have to ask you, because I do, for better or for worse, the 1993 Three Musketeers, I do love that movie. I mean, it's Charlie Sheen, Kiefer Sutherland, Chris O'Donnell as like these Frenchmen, right? You're like, what? And it's got so much anachronistic stuff, but it has such charm. And there are things that you can spot now, mistakes where I'm like, oh, I see the stunt double. But just when there's all the multiple like choreography and the fight scenes going on, like at the end, they've got like people in the courtyard, they got people on the roof fighting, people on the balcony. You're like, how did they coordinate all this? This took a lot of time and a lot of effort. And you like the people. There's entertaining. Tim Curry's delicious Cardinal in it, and of course it's got great music, the big pop hit, All for Love. I love it, and I'm like, this is the kind of movie that I shouldn't like, but I do. And it came around, I guess, at the right time, that it had the adult things. It had the winks, the kisses, and the romance, but it had a lot of, great fight scenes and action sword fights. And it was popular. It was a hit at the time. And now I sit back and think that kind of movie, it will not be made today. It would be a special thing to come out on Disney Plus probably. But it's like, it's a shame that we lost something like that. I like that one. I imagine you don't, Miss Zita.
I have never seen it.
Oh, really?
So I have no opinion on it. One thing I will say, your note that, oh, you have this all-American cast and they're all meant to be French. This is one of the things that I love most about historical dramas. When they cast people from all around the world, you have this very international cast, and they're all meant to be from one country, say Germany, and there are certain cast members who have committed hard to doing an accent, and then other cast members have decided, I'm just going to stick with my British accent while I'm on set. And so you end up with this bizarre film in which the Cardinal sounds like he's from Munich, but then Ian McKellen shows up and suddenly we're back in London. I find it very funny, and I think it's generally entertaining. There's something essentially stodgy about especially English language productions that are meant to be set in France. And these actors get so much praise for, oh, wow, he did such a good French accent. And you think, well, if you were really going for accuracy, you would have shot the entire film in the French language. Learning how to do a French accented English dialect isn't all that accurate. It's almost weirder than just letting the actor use their natural voice. At the same time, I am in favor of actors being able to come up with their own weird dialects. If you've ever heard Meryl Streep in Out of Africa, that accent has no connection to the Danish language. She, every Dane that I've ever met has told me, oh my God, what's even going on there? But it's incredible. No one else sounds like that. More actors should aspire to that level of craziness.
We come back full circle to Robin Hood Men in Tights. You know, unlike other Robin Hoods, I speak with an English accent. You know, that's also, I guess, part of it too, that we came along to mocking these types of things, and that worked for a while. But now I feel like we're all just in like Jackass type punked kind of phase where everything has to be a slapstick kind of comedy where it doesn't work. But and I miss that. I miss the kind of friendly charm and innocence. And speaking of Carrie Elways, again, it strays more into fantasy. The Princess Bride, is that on the 300 Passions list?
Yes, I believe it made it. So that one is interesting in that it wants to be both a parody and a relatively sincere tribute to this type of film.
But I think that one works because it's so cute when you have like little Fred Savage being like, oh my God, is there kissing coming up in this story? The fact that it's got those kind of bookends, I think makes it much nicer. Because you said earlier, Vincent Cassel getting excited. I got excited thinking of a Three Musketeers with him again, actual French. There was a Beauty and the Beast version I saw with him that was much darker compared to the lighthearted Disney, which kind of removes the whole Stockholm syndrome of that story. You're like, this is not really a nice fantasy kind of story. You know, I said before, Sleeping Beauty is my favorite of the Disney movies, but again, the original fairy tales of sort of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White and Rose Red are much darker stories. And again, that's where I feel like instead of telling something as just a straight adventure, we feel the need to decide that's going to be fantasy. Oh, we're going to make a horror version of that, which of course, I can't lie. Do I eat up the horror versions? Yes, absolutely. But it's like, well, no, can't we just have something pleasant? I feel like we forgot.
You're not a fan of Winnie Pooh, Blood and Honey?
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it yet. No.
Oh,
And then we're getting angry about what's happening now, but this is nothing new. Again, like I love that Ivanhoe movie, and I was like, oh, show me more. And there's a King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, also in the 50s with Robert Taylor. And I remember my dad being like, 5th century English king. Look, they're all dressed up in their 14th century French castle. And again, the way these things the way that literature came about, you had, you know, William the Conqueror kind of conquered England, and whatever their original legends were co-opted when, you know, Mallory did like La Morte d'Arthur, my French accent is terrible, where, you know, Lancelot was added and all the stories were kind of changed and lumped together, you know. And so it's like this kind of entertainment has been recycling itself for many, many, many hundreds of years. You know, we're just at this new medium. And you're right. Are we at some kind of crossroads of where we're going with this kind of storytelling? Do you have any favorites, Zita?
Oh, gosh. So within the adventure genre, that's very difficult to narrow down. I knew we were going to get here eventually, but I guess the ones I've already referenced, the original Thief of Baghdad, definitely make an effort to seek that out. There's a wonderful 2013 restoration that you can find online. It's perfect. It's spellbinding. You also have a couple of Buster Keaton films, in particular The General. I was tentatively considering this one because I wondered, does it really count as an adventure film? But then I thought, well, yes, it does. It's sort of a misadventure. Obviously, he wants to thwart this plan. He needs to get the girl. He needs to ensure that his beloved train doesn't get destroyed. So it does count in my eyes. And then progressing on further, you do have a lot of these classic 30s films. Obviously, The Adventures of Robin Hood comes to mind. But then you also have something that's a bit weirder, such as If I Were a King, which doesn't get brought up much nowadays, but is pretty charming. It's one of the Ronald Colman films, and I melt in his presence. He's a wonderful on-screen heartthrob. I think he's a great actor. I believe he had a fantastic reputation on the stage in Britain, and then in American movies, he is basically called upon to be a dreamboat, but he's very good at that, so I'm not complaining. And then, of course, some people would count Taboo, the famed F.W. Murnau film. I'm not sure whether I would, but it's a great movie, so we'll put it in there. And then rounding it out, you have Call of the Wild with Loretta Young and Clark Gable. This movie is primarily famous as the film that resulted in him impregnating her with his love child, and then she gave birth to the child, but because she was a devout Catholic, she was very concerned about people learning that she had given birth to a child out of wedlock with a married man. And so for the rest of her life, she tried to keep the father of her child's identity secret. And of course, you feel very sympathetic towards her. It would have been incredibly difficult to be in that situation in the 30s. At the same time, getting back to the film, it's really rather good. They have strong chemistry, I would say, even though you feel a bit bad about the direction that their relationship headed in real life. And beautiful shots of nature. William A. Wellman directed it, a very solid journeyman director, has a great understanding of how to capture outdoors environments, especially at this early point in cinema history during the studio system period in which most movies were shot on sets on a production lot. And so it is interesting to see them outdoors in this movie, getting roughed up in the snow. And it's beautifully made. It's nice and short. I think it's a great film to watch on a lazy Sunday afternoon. So that's the last one that I would recommend. Sorry for the exhaustive list.
We spent another exhaustive episode talking about the Western as well. And America, I guess, has an interesting... I wouldn't say Westerns replaced adventure films, but I feel like they both began to die out at the same time in the 80s, which is another maybe interesting, bigger sociological kind of correlation. And yet both of them have tried to come back, and neither has quite succeeded. So that's kind of interesting that they tend to get lumped together. Like now when you're going through streaming and they do have adventure categories or Western categories, you tend to see a lot of the same things repeated and lumped together. So it almost seems like anything, any area or period or history that we romanticize, pirate ships, type of things. And even some of those, Raoul Walsh, he did a couple of movies with John Wayne that were, the Red Witch, Curse of the Red Witch. I think I wrote about these at InSession Film, but they're basically John Wayne being John Wayne on a ship as a sea captain instead of being a cowboy. So it's like we tend to, I guess, the things that we romanticize are what we make these fun adventure things. And we always keep coming back to Jungle Cruise as being the lone reference we have of these new things. And it's bad when we romanticize the wrong things, which I think Hollywood and cinema has done quite a bit over the century. But at the same time, it's like in some ways, like you said, just a movie for the family to watch on a Sunday afternoon, not Old Yeller, because that'll make you cry. But it's like what happened to that? Now it becomes a obligation to watch all the TV shows, or like I said, it's expensive for family just to go to a weekend movie, which is sad. So like you want to completely blow up the whole system and start all over again. I'm wondering where we could go next. I don't know. This is probably why I keep retreating to some of these same favorites, and I reread a lot of these classic books. it seems strange that I don't read new books anymore. Even the way I'm retreating from watching new movies, I also keep reading the same books, that there's a certain, I don't know, love to them as well, which is a whole separate issue. That books also, I feel like, not that they're a thing of the past, but I like real books. You know, sometimes those old Tarzan books, I love the way they smell. The paper, you know, it just sets me back to a specific time and place. And that's what a lot of these movies do. Like when I watch Musketeer movies, I remember, you know, loving Michael York and Christopher Lee, you know, and Charlie Sheen, for better or for worse. Did you write about The Princess Bride for the Passions list?
No, I haven't done that yet, in part because I worry that I don't have much to say about it, but hopefully I can cook up some takes on it at some point.
Because we talked about the African Queen previously in our Bogart list, and that I know is quite high on the Passions list, isn't it?
Mm.
And yet it's like, this is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. A man and a woman on a boat, adventure ensues. What else are you doing at In Session Film?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on a review of The Most Dangerous Game. So we're finally getting around to that. One of the great adventure movies.
Another great story as well. Great book. Been done multiple times. Who would you, it's funny, if you were making that today, who would you cast in it?
Ooh, modern adaptation of The Most Dangerous Game. I think you would have to alter the tone a bit. I don't think we really have an actor today who can really match up to Joel McRae. So you would have to completely change everything, really. Gosh, which actors do I like now? I suppose I could go for the boring pick and select Adam Driver as the lead, he's in everything at the moment. But I think that has happened for a reason. He is a very likable screen presence. As much as Kristin might disagree with me, I think he's very affable, and I think he's quite handsome too. Sorry for objectifying him. So I think he would be an effective action movie lead. I don't think he gives too much away. I think he's convincing as a cool dude on screen, and that's what a lot of audience members seem to want. And in terms of who would direct it, gosh. I guess J.C. Shandor could do it.
Interesting, because you know me, I just resort to all my favorites, which made me think of The Time Machine. What went wrong with that movie? Because again, it was 2002, and yet it was trying to adapt a book, and there was already a beloved movie, and then they tried to change things and add modern things, and you're like, yes, it's an entertaining movie, but you can see all the flaws in it, everything that was wrong with like our modern sensibilities on just what should be a fun, you know, time travel adventure. But there we are. Do you think that the genre will come back eventually? Just straight adventures, not comic books and superheroes?
I don't think it'll ever come back in the sort of costume drama centric form that we've been praising throughout this episode. When people want costume dramas nowadays, they seem to either want historical dramas like The Crown, which have something to say about politics, that reflect on history from a modern vantage point, or they want fluffy, romantic / erotic dramas like Bridgerton. And it does feel as though adventure movies really have to blend in with other genres now in order to survive. So I fear that Kong Skull Island is sort of the best that we're going to get for now. It is an adventure movie technically, but it's also more than that, a monster movie. And I think that's what we just have to deal with.
It's, I wrote about that in my Tom Hiddleston list. Tom Hiddleston, Samuel L. Jackson, Brie Larson. There's a lot of good people in that, but it's like the movie's not about the people. It's a lot of the people walking around in really nice locations and seeing really cool monsters. And so it's not about the people. It could have been. Again, if it had been done Indiana Jones style with Hiddleston, around this island with all this adventure happening, it probably would have been really, really wonderful. But as you're watching it, you're like, yeah, he's just there to be Tom Hiddleston. And then you get to the big monster fight when it's Kong fighting some weird skull head monster thing, and you're like, but I'll be damned, this is a good drag down knockout kind of fight, even though you're completely aware that it's all CGI. and CGI, when it's done right like that, I guess works, but today so much of it is rushed, and these poor people don't get paid for their time and their efforts. And sometimes I sit back and go, what was wrong with the practical effects? But I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I don't know. Zita, do you have a preference between that?
Not necessarily. I think it depends. There's a part of me that thinks, yes, it's frustrating now when you have so much CGI in a lot of these films. And I think one of the big problems in these cases is not the CGI itself or its presence in these films, but the fact that the workers who have to put all of this together are under so much pressure. They're facing these ridiculous time crunches. Their bosses are not giving them enough time to put out quality work. And so you do end up with this shoddy special effects work. And I do not think that's their fault. I think if they were given the opportunity, they would put in their best effort. But they have a ridiculously short amount of time to slap something together. And so you can understand why you end up with these movies that are visual monstrosities in many regards. And I'm not one of those people who's obsessed with practical effects in the way that some are. And I think that the blanket generalization that, CGI is the problem with the industry and we should go back to the time in which nobody used it. No, CGI has plenty of practical purposes, and there's plenty of CGI that you just don't notice in films. Say a period drama where they need to alter something in the background, they need to make a slight cosmetic change to a certain location. It's very useful there. It's not obtrusive. It doesn't mean that the entire screen is filled up with imagery that looks synthetic and artificial. And I think that the workers should be given more respect by their employers, obviously. And I do wonder whether we would hear less complaints about all of this awful CGI in cinema if there were less pressure being placed upon them.
Some of my favorite books actually is Horatio Hornblower, which you could say is slightly different from adventure. They're Napoleonic kind of war kind of stories. And they made a couple, a TV movie series of them in the 90s with Ioan Gruffudd in them. And part of me sits back and goes, why can't you just have a fake ship and put all the people on the ship? And who pushed Sawyer? Who knocked out the captain and took over the ship with mutiny? Like, isn't that all you need? Isn't that enough adventure? And it's interesting if we say CGI, it was a big scandal when Jurassic Park first came out that, oh my God, they changed Laura Dern's, put her face on a stunt woman. And it almost seems like was the advent of CGI when it came around right at that same time did the adventure decline. So it's an interesting intersection because you would think CGI would benefit the adventure, which for something like 300, I think it did, where it captured the complete mix of storytelling, comic book, fantasy, design. And now I sit back and think, not every movie needs to be in one of these like 3D panoramic kind of green screen kind of sets. Like you said, something about them being outdoors. It's just amazing. So I don't know. We'll have to see where the industry goes, I suppose, because at the same instance, they're throwing these huge budgets to things just to go to streaming that aren't going into the cinema. So, but then it's like, but do costume pieces cost too much? They're not going to put enough money into those, or they don't get enough return in their marketing, who promotes anything anymore. So it's an interesting crossroads.
Yes, it is. And I suppose we'll see along what lines cinema develops in the next few years. And who knows, I could go from being the grump of the podcast to being positive about everything. I could be insufferable in a completely different manner. So watch out.
As long as they keep casting my favorites in big costume epic pieces, I'm happy. That's fine. You're working on The Most Dangerous Game. What was the last thing you wrote at InSessionFilm.com?
Oh gosh. Sorry, I'm not aware, but on my podcast at the moment, I'm recording an episode on Some Like It Hot. So that should be interesting. An absolute classic. And obviously there's a lot to address there in terms of its handling of gender politics and questions about sexual orientation and how a person should have to identify.
Saint Omar, that was the last thing you did at InSessionFilm.com. I'm looking at
great. Yes, the fabulous French film.
Yes. Looking at our sophisticated website now. Of course, we've recorded a few things here, and generally we're weekly on weekends. But as I said, our schedule may change up because we've had our new baby. We're all aunties now in the family here. New baby alert. So you can keep an eye at InSession Film on Twitter. They have a Patreon as well. You can watch the main flagship podcast on YouTube as well. So keep an eye out for all the exciting things that are happening at InSession Film, and because maybe we do have listeners. That's kind of nice, Zita. Thank you for being here as always.
Thank you, Kristin.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you're so sweet. Yes, thank you, dear listeners. And we'll see you at the next Women in Session.
We made USAA insurance for veterans like James. When he found out how much USAA was helping members save, he said,
It's time to switch.
"We'll help you find the right coverage at the right price." USAA. What you're made of, we're made for. Restrictions apply.